Mr. Mercer, your property sits within our designated expansion corridor. We filed an easement claim. You have 30 days to vacate the northern pasture or we begin enforcement.
She handed me a folder, county logo on the front, her signature on the inside. I took it, read the first paragraph, then I looked up at her. "Thank you, Sharon," I said. "This is exactly what I needed." She heard that as sarcasm. It wasn't. She was standing on my grandfather's land her organization had no legal authority to enter, holding a document referencing a statute she clearly hadn't finished reading, with 2 witnesses she'd brought herself standing 6 feet behind her. She'd given me her name in writing, a verbal enforcement threat on record, and a signed claim with a fatal flaw buried in paragraph 3. She'd been here 9 minutes. I could have ended it that afternoon. 1 phone call. Done. But Sharon Voss was the kind of person who couldn't leave a win alone. She'd keep going, keep adding, keep making sure I understood who held the power here. And every step she took past this moment was going to cost her in ways she hadn't started calculating yet. So I smiled, thanked her for the folder, and let her walk back down the ridge. The recording on my phone ran another 40 seconds after she left. I let it run. If you can already see someone walking into a trap, do you warn them? Or do you wait to see how far they'll go on their own? My name is Cole Mercer. I'm 44 years old, former Army Corps of Engineers, 12 years active before I came home to Wyoming with a bad knee, a good surveying eye, and enough patience to outlast most problems. I don't say that to sound impressive. I say it because it matters later. The Corps teaches you a specific kind of thinking, not fast thinking, structural thinking. You look at a problem and you don't ask, how do I fix this right now? You ask, what is this system actually doing and where does it fail? You learn to read a site before you touch it. You learn that most catastrophic failures aren't sudden, they're accumulated. Small decisions, compounding quietly, until one morning something gives and everyone acts surprised. I brought that habit home with me. I run the ranch alone, mostly. 62 acres of mixed grassland and timber, a small herd, 2 structures that need more work than they get, and a fence line I walk every Saturday morning before the heat sets in. I keep records the way my grandfather kept records. Handwritten logs, dated photographs, a filing cabinet in the back room that my cousin Dana once described as disturbingly organized for a man who owns chickens. I don't own chickens. I own 4 head of cattle and a border collie named Stitch, who takes the fence line more seriously than I do. The point is, I am not a man who looks for fights. I've spent most of my adult life learning how to assess a situation before committing to it, how to preserve resources, how to recognize when something is a real problem and when it just looks like one. The Corps drilled that into me so deep it's reflex now. Which is why, when Sharon Voss walked off the access road and onto my property that Wednesday morning without notice or invitation, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make threats. I didn't call anyone while she was still standing in front of me. I just listened. I watched. I filed everything she gave me, verbally, physically, digitally, into the part of my brain that had been trained to catalog exactly this kind of thing. The folder she handed me went into a plastic sleeve that evening. The recording on my phone got uploaded to a cloud folder I keep for property documentation. Her business card went into the filing cabinet, behind a new tab I labeled with the date. I'd started a file on Sharon Voss before she reached the bottom of the ridge. She didn't know that yet. She also didn't know what was sitting in a manila envelope behind my grandfather's workbench in the back of the equipment shed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My grandfather Hank had a rule he repeated so often it stopped sounding like wisdom and started sounding like weather. Just something that was always there. Don't fight a man's first move, he'd say. Wait for his last one. I didn't understand it when I was 12. I thought it meant be patient. I thought it was old man advice about not losing your temper, the kind of thing you nod at and file away and never actually use. I understand it now. It doesn't mean be passive. It doesn't mean absorb whatever someone throws at you and smile. It means a person's first move is almost never their real move. It's a test. It's a probe. It's them checking to see what you're made of and whether you'll panic and make their job easier. If you react immediately, at full force to the first move, you've shown them everything. Your range, your resources, your ceiling. You've turned a skirmish into a negotiation where they already know your terms.
But if you wait, if you stay quiet and let them keep going, something happens. They get comfortable. They start assuming your silence is weakness, and comfortable people get sloppy. They overextend. They stop checking. They start making moves they can't walk back because they've already decided you're not a real threat. And then you have something much better than a win in a skirmish. You have a record. A pattern, a sequence of choices they made freely, repeatedly, after being given every opportunity to stop. That's not just a win, that's a case. I've seen it work both ways in my life. I've watched men in the Corps blow up at the first sign of friction and spend the next 3 months managing the fallout from their own reaction. I've watched contractors bully landowners into settlements because the landowner swung too early, showed their hand, and gave the other side time to prepare. I've also watched quiet men dismantle systems that looked immovable, not because they were smarter or stronger, but because they understood that time is a resource, and most people spend it recklessly. The thing about people who abuse power, and I had dealt with enough of them by my mid-40s to recognize the type on sight, is that they are almost always undone by themselves, not by their opponents, by their own certainty. By the gap between how much authority they think they have and how much they actually have, by the trail they leave when they stop worrying about being caught. You don't have to beat people like that. You just have to stay in the room long enough for them to beat themselves. Sharon Voss had been on my land for 9 minutes, and she'd already started. Is staying silent in the face of injustice a form of weakness, or sometimes the only way to make sure the punishment actually fits the crime? Let me tell you what 62 acres in Wyoming actually means. Not the market value, not the assessed tax rate, not what some developer sees when he runs comps on expansion corridor land and divides it into quarter-acre lots with vinyl fences and coordinated mailboxes. I mean what it actually means. My grandfather Hank bought this land in 1951 for less than the price of a used pickup truck. He was 26 years old, fresh out of the service, and he'd watched his own father lose a farm in Nebraska to a bank that moved faster than the harvest. He swore it wouldn't happen to him. He bought the cheapest land he could find in a state that still had space, and he spent the next 4 decades building something on it that wasn't about money. It was about staying. He raised my father here. My father raised me here. Summers and school breaks until the divorce made the visits irregular, and then the army made them rarer. But every time I came back, 22, 30, 38, the land was the same. The ridge was the same. The elk came down every morning from the same tree line, the same way they had since before any of us were born. When my father passed, the property came to me. I moved back full-time 3 years ago, fixed the fence line, repaired the equipment shed, started sleeping through the night for the first time in years. This land is not a financial asset to me. It is the only place in my life that has never changed into something I didn't recognize. And Ridgeline Estates, that slow, beige, cookie-cutter infection creeping toward my western fence, had been eyeing it for exactly that reason. Not because they needed it, because it sat in the middle of what they wanted to turn into something else entirely. Because 62 acres of open Wyoming ranch land sitting between their existing development and their next phase was the one thing their maps couldn't route around. They needed me gone. Sharon's visit wasn't a legal maneuver. It was an opening offer and a pressure campaign designed to make selling feel easier than fighting. She'd done it before. I just didn't know that yet. I would, soon enough. But even before I knew the full scope of what she was running, I understood one thing with complete clarity. Whatever was coming, I was not going to lose this land. Not to Sharon Voss. Not to anyone. My attorney, a sharp, unhurried man named Garrett, who'd handled Wyoming property law for 30 years, looked at Sharon's easement claim for about 4 minutes before he set it down. Paper thin, he said. The 1987 Regional Development Act has a carve-out for conservation-adjacent land that makes this essentially unenforceable as written. Whoever drafted this either didn't finish reading the statute or assumed you wouldn't.
I asked him what we should do. He said file a formal objection, send a certified response, shut it down clean. Standard procedure. 2 weeks, maybe 3, and it goes away. I told him to hold off. He looked at me the way attorneys look at clients who are about to make their lives harder. Cole, this is a bad claim. We can beat it easily. I know, I said.
That's why I want to wait. Because here's the thing Garrett didn't know yet. The thing I'd spent the first week after Sharon's visit quietly confirming through county public records. This wasn't the first time. It took me 3 evenings at the county assessor's database and 2 calls to the clerk's office to find them. 4 other landowners along the Ridgeline expansion corridor. 4 separate properties, each one targeted within the past 18 months. Each one preceded by the same sequence, a questionable easement claim, followed by zoning complaints filed against the property, followed by utility and access disruptions that appeared bureaucratic on the surface, but landed with the precision of something coordinated. All 4 had sold. I pulled the transfer records. All 4 properties had been purchased by the same entity, Summit View Acquisitions, LLC. I wrote the name down and called Dana. Dana Mercer is my father's niece on his second marriage, which makes her my cousin by a route most people give up trying to follow. She is also a forensic accountant with 15 years of experience tracing money through structures designed specifically to not be traced. When I told her the name of the LLC, she was quiet for a moment. "Give me a few days," she said. She called back in 2. Summit View Acquisitions was registered in Delaware. The registered agent was a man named Gregory Voss, Sharon's husband. I sat with that for a long time. Outside, the evening was cooling down, and the elk were moving along the upper ridge the way they do at dusk, slow and deliberate, like they own the mountain, because they've always owned the mountain. This wasn't a homeowners association protecting community aesthetics. This was an overzealous bureaucracy or a personality conflict with a difficult neighbor. This was a land acquisition operation, systematic, repeated, successful 4 times in 18 months. And Sharon Voss had walked onto my property, handed me a signed document, and made a recorded verbal threat, because she had no reason to believe I would look any harder than the 4 landowners before me had. That was her first real mistake. I started a second folder that night. I labeled it Pattern. Have you ever watched someone repeat the same play on the wrong person and realize they had no idea the game had already changed? The morning after Dana called me with Greg Voss's name, I drove into town and sat across from Garrett in his office for 45 minutes. I laid it out clean. The 4 prior sales, the LLC, the registered agent, the pattern of easement claims, followed by zoning complaints, followed by access disruptions, followed by a sale to the same buyer every single time. Garrett listened without interrupting, which is how I knew he understood the weight of it. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Cole," he said, "what you're describing, if it holds up, is not a civil property dispute. What you're describing is organized fraud, possibly racketeering." "I know. Which means the right move is to take this to the AG's office, today, with what you have." I said, "Not yet." He put both hands flat on the desk. "You have enough to file a complaint that would freeze their operation and potentially trigger an investigation that protects not just you, but the next landowner they go after." "I know that too." "Then why?" "Because what I have right now is a pattern that looks like evidence," I said. "What I need is evidence that is evidence." Dana's still pulling the financials. The LLC registration is public, but the transaction history needs another week, and Sharon hasn't finished yet. Garrett frowned. "What do you mean she hasn't finished?" "She filed a claim she knows is unenforceable, which means the claim isn't the play. It's the opening move. She's waiting for me to fight it through proper channels, get tied up in paperwork, and then the zoning complaints start. Then the access issues. Then I'm bleeding money and time on 3 fronts at once, and selling starts to look rational." I paused. "She needs to run the full sequence. I need her to run the full sequence." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to let her escalate?"
I'm going to let her make choices, I said, freely, repeatedly, on the record. Garrett is not a man who gets visibly uncomfortable, but he shifted in his chair. There's a version of this, he said carefully, where you wait too long and she does real damage. There's also a version, I said, where I move too early, she retreats, restructures, and the next person on that corridor loses their land because I didn't finish it when I had the chance. He didn't argue with that. Before I left, I asked him to draft one letter, not a legal objection, just a formal written notice to the Ridgeline HOA board stating that I was aware of the easement claim, that I considered it without legal merit, and that any further action against my property should be directed to my attorney. A warning. Mild, clean, documented. She could stop here. She had the chance. I already knew she wouldn't take it. When you can see someone standing at the edge of a mistake and you give them a clear signal to step back, and they don't, at what point does what happens next become entirely their own doing? Garrett's letter arrived at the Ridgeline HOA office on a Thursday. Sharon signed the delivery confirmation herself. I have the receipt. She responded 4 days later, not through her attorney, not through the board, personally, in writing, on HOA letterhead, with her title printed underneath her signature in bold. The letter said, and I am paraphrasing only slightly, "The easement claim stands, the corridor designation is final, and Mr. Mercer's refusal to engage constructively leaves the association no choice but to pursue all available remedies." I read it twice, folded it, put it in the sleeve behind Garrett's letter. She hadn't just ignored the warning. She'd responded to it in writing, on official stationery, under her own name and title, doubling down on a claim her own HOA attorney, had she bothered to consult one, would have told her was unenforceable. The week after that, the zoning complaints started. 3 of them, filed on consecutive days with the county planning office, each one targeting a different aspect of my property. A structure setback on the equipment shed, a grading issue near the north fence line, a question about my road access permit dating back to before I was born. Each complaint was technically formatted correctly. Each one was also, on examination, either factually wrong or referencing a code that didn't apply to agricultural land my size. But technically formatted complaints still have to be answered. They still generate correspondence. They still show up in your property record. And answering 3 of them simultaneously costs time and money, regardless of how wrong they are. I documented each one. Date filed, complaint number, specific code cited, specific reason the citation was inapplicable. I built a parallel record. My responses, my evidence, my timeline, running alongside hers. Dana called midway through that week. The financial trail on Summit View acquisitions was starting to come together. Transaction records, wire transfers, a pattern of purchases that followed the HOA pressure campaigns with a consistency that was, in Dana's words, not subtle once you know what you're looking at. The rope was getting longer. Sharon just kept pulling it toward herself. How many people have walked confidently into a room without realizing every door behind them was quietly locking? 3 weeks after Sharon's first visit, I drove to the county recorder's office and spent 4 hours at a public terminal pulling every document I was legally entitled to pull. Deed history on all 5 properties along the corridor, including mine. The original HOA incorporation filing for Ridgeline Estates. Sharon's board appointment records. The zoning complaint submissions, all 3 against my property, and the ones filed against the 4 prior landowners, which were still in the public record if you knew what you were looking for and had the patience to look. I brought a USB drive. I copied everything. That same week, I set up 2 additional trail cameras on my property. I already had one covering the equipment shed, standard ranch practice, positioned to cover the access road and the northern fence line. Not because I expected Sharon to trespass again, because I expected her to send someone else, and I wanted clean footage with embedded timestamps when she did. I also called each of the 4 prior landowners. 2 didn't want to talk. Understandable. They'd sold, moved on, and revisiting it cost them something emotionally they weren't willing to spend. I thanked them and didn't push. The third, a retired teacher named Pauline who'd owned 12 acres 2 lots south of my western fence, talked for an hour and a half. She remembered every detail. The easement claim, the zoning notices. The week her water access permit was flagged for administrative review with no explanation, which took 6 weeks and 2 attorney consultations to resolve. The phone call she eventually received from a man named Greg, she hadn't known his last name then, who was just checking in to see if she'd considered selling. She hadn't connected Greg to the HOA until I said his last name out loud. There was a long silence on the line. "Oh," she said quietly. "Oh, that's what that was." I asked if she'd be willing to provide a written statement about her experience. She said yes, without hesitating. The fourth landowner, a rancher named Bill who'd sold 8 months ago, agreed to a recorded phone call. He remembered the sequence almost identically to Pauline. He also remembered signing the sale documents at a title company in Cheyenne that, when I looked it up, shared a registered address with Summit View Acquisitions. I added both statements to the file. The file now had 4 sections and a timeline that ran to 11 pages. Sharon had been running this operation for 18 months. I had been building the case for less than 4 weeks. I wasn't close to done. The road access permit came through on a Tuesday, not a complaint this time, an actual revocation notice issued by the County Roads Department stating that my access permit, the same permit that had allowed vehicles to reach my property from the county road since 1954, had been flagged for administrative irregularity and suspended pending review. I stood at the mailbox and read it twice. The permit was older than the Roads Department employee who signed the suspension notice. It predated the current county charter. It had been renewed without incident through 6 different county administrations across 7 decades. My grandfather had framed the original and hung it in the equipment shed next to a photograph of the access road being graded for the first time. And now it was suspended, pending review, with no timeline given. Without that permit, I couldn't legally receive deliveries, couldn't bring in hay or feedstock, couldn't get the vet out for the cattle without routing through a neighbor's easement 2 miles south, which added 40 minutes each way and required a conversation I didn't want to have weekly. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was expensive, inconvenient, and designed to be both. I called the Roads Department. The clerk I spoke to was polite and clearly uncomfortable. She said the review had been initiated by a third-party complaint filed the previous week. She couldn't tell me who filed it. I asked if it was standard procedure for a permit this old to be suspended on the basis of a third-party complaint without prior notice to the permit holder. She paused. "I'll have to look into that," she said. I asked her to note that I'd called, with the date and time, and to confirm by email. She sent the confirmation 11 minutes later. I printed it and added it to the file. That evening, I walked the fence line later than usual. The sun was already behind the ridge, the air cooling fast the way it does at elevation, and Stitch ran ahead of me through the grass like she was checking each post personally. I thought about the 4 landowners who'd gotten this far and decided it wasn't worth it. I understood the feeling. I did not share it. The Ridgeline Estates HOA held a community meeting on the 2nd Thursday of every month in the common room of their main clubhouse, open to residents, agenda posted publicly on their website 48 hours in advance. I was not a resident, but the meeting was listed as open to the public, and the agenda for that particular Thursday included an item titled Corridor Expansion Update, Mercer Property Status. I drove over. Sharon was already at the front of the room when I walked in, standing behind a folding table with a projector screen behind her, showing a map of the corridor. She saw me come through the door and something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. She hadn't expected me, but she recovered fast. There were maybe 30 residents in the room. Folding chairs, bad lighting, a coffee urn on a side table that smelled like it had been running since noon. Sharon introduced the agenda item by explaining that the association's expansion corridor was proceeding as planned, that the remaining unincorporated parcel, she did not say my name, just the remaining parcel, was in the process of being brought into compliance and that residents could expect groundbreaking on the next phase within the quarter. A resident near the back raised her hand and asked what brought into compliance meant. Sharon smiled. It means the property owner has been formally notified of the easement designation and is expected to respond accordingly. Another resident asked what would happen if the owner didn't respond accordingly. Sharon's smile stayed exactly where it was. Then the association exercises its development rights under the Regional Development Act. We don't need the owner's permission. We need their absence. We don't need the owner's permission. We need their absence. I wrote that down in the small notebook I'd brought, with the date, the time, and a note that approximately 30 residents were present. Several of them saw me writing. One man near the aisle glanced at me and then quickly looked away. I did not speak during the meeting. I did not raise my hand. When the agenda item concluded and Sharon moved to the next item, I stood, nodded once to the room in general, and left. In the parking lot, I sat in my truck for a moment and read the sentence back to myself. We don't need the owner's permission. We need their absence. Said out loud, in public, in front of 30 witnesses. I added it to the file under a new section I labeled Direct Statements. It was, without question, the most useful thing Sharon Voss had ever done for me. How much does a person have to believe in their own untouchability before they start saying the quiet part out loud, in a room full of witnesses? 10 days after the community meeting, a contractor's truck pulled up to my northern fence line at 7 in the morning. 2 men got out. They had a survey kit, a set of rolled plans, and a clipboard with a work order attached. The work order referenced the Ridgeline Estates expansion project. The survey stakes they started driving were 18 inches inside my fence line. I walked out to meet them. The older of the 2 men, sunburned and matter-of-fact, handed me a copy of the work order without being asked. He said they'd been contracted by Ridgeline Estates to begin preliminary site marking for Phase 2 development. He said he understood there might be a property dispute, but that his job was to follow the work order and that any legal questions weren't his department. I told him calmly that he was standing on private property, that the survey stakes he'd placed were inside my fence line and therefore on my land, and that I was going to need him to stop until the boundary question was resolved through proper channels. He called someone on his cell phone, talked for 2 minutes, came back and said they'd been instructed to continue. I said, I understand. I want you to know I'm documenting this, and I'd appreciate your contractor license number for my records. He hesitated, gave it to me. I wrote it down. I went inside and called Garrett. Garrett filed an emergency trespass injunction that afternoon. The contractor received a cease and desist by end of business. The survey stakes, 8 of them, all inside my property line, all photographed with GPS coordinates before they were pulled, went into an evidence bag in my filing cabinet. But Sharon didn't stop there. The following week, a utility subcontractor arrived to perform maintenance on the power line running along my access road. Maintenance that somehow resulted in a 4-day outage affecting my property specifically and no one else on the line. The utility company, when I called, had no record of scheduling any maintenance in my area. When I asked who had requested the work order, the supervisor put me on hold for 6 minutes and came back sounding careful. He said the request had come through a third-party facilities management account he couldn't identify further without an internal review. I asked him to initiate the review and confirm by email. He did. 4 days without power, generator fuel, refrigerated medication for one of the cattle, 2 missed deliveries that required rescheduling. All of it documented. All of it dated. Then the HOA's attorney sent Garrett a letter asserting that my equipment shed, the one my grandfather built in 1967, the one with the framed access permit hanging inside it, was a non-conforming structure under the new Ridgeline design standards, and that the association reserved the right to seek its removal as a condition of corridor compliance. Garrett called me after he read it. Cole, he said, they've now involved a contractor, a utility subcontractor, and outside legal counsel. They've generated work orders, a utility request, and a formal legal letter, all in 10 days. I know, I said. That's a lot of people who are now going to have to explain their involvement. Yes, I said, it is. There was a pause. How much longer are you going to let this run? He asked. I thought about the manila envelope in the equipment shed, the one I'd found behind my grandfather's workbench 8 weeks ago, the one I still hadn't shown Garrett. Not much longer, I said. His name was Robert Tillon. He'd lived in Ridgeline Estates for 2 years. Corner unit, second phase, the kind of man who kept his lawn edged and his opinions private. He'd been at the community meeting the night I walked in. He was the one near the aisle who'd glanced at me when I was writing and then looked away fast. He knocked on my door on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the contractor incident. He was holding a coffee thermos, and he looked like a man who'd been arguing with himself about whether to come for longer than the drive over would explain. I invited him in. He sat at my grandfather's kitchen table and turned the thermos in his hands for a moment before he spoke. He said he'd been on the HOA's facilities committee for 14 months. Not the board, the committee. The level where you reviewed vendor contracts and maintenance schedules and didn't ask too many questions about where the decisions above you came from. He said he'd noticed things, vendor invoices that didn't match work descriptions, a line item in the operating budget labeled corridor facilitation that no one on the committee had been able to get a straight answer about. A meeting 6 months ago where Sharon had announced the Mercer property acquisition as essentially concluded, which had surprised him because he hadn't been aware any acquisition had been formally approved by the full board. He said he hadn't said anything because he wasn't sure what he was looking at, and because Sharon ran the board the way some people run a room, by making it quietly clear that friction had consequences. He said he'd gone home after the community meeting and sat with it for 3 weeks. He said watching me write in that notebook while Sharon said what she said had done something to him he couldn't fully explain. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him one question. Would he be willing to provide a written account of what he'd observed, signed, and dated for potential use in a legal proceeding? He was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the ridge. Yeah, he said. I think I would. I got a legal pad from the filing cabinet. He wrote for 40 minutes. His handwriting was small and careful, and he didn't cross anything out. I made him a copy before he left. He folded it into his jacket pocket and drove back down the access road without looking back. I added his statement to the file. The file now had 6 sections. The injunction hearing was scheduled for the 14th of November. That gave me 19 days. Garrett had filed to block further trespass and halt any development activity on or adjacent to my property pending resolution of the easement dispute. Standard procedure. But standard procedure in a county where Ridgeline Estates had been operating for 3 years, filing paperwork, attending meetings, writing checks to the right civic organizations. Standard procedure moved at the speed of whoever was comfortable with whom. The hearing judge had been assigned randomly. Garrett didn't know him well. That cut both ways. Meanwhile, Sharon had not slowed down. 8 days before the hearing, a second legal letter arrived from the HOA's attorney. This one informed me that Ridgeline Estates had filed a formal development application with the County Planning Board for Phase 2 construction, which included, explicitly, parcels within what the application described as the Mercer Easement Corridor. The application had been submitted 3 weeks prior. It had already passed first review. I read that sentence twice. First review, passed, 3 weeks ago. I called Garrett. They filed while the injunction was pending, he said. He sounded controlled but tight. That's either a procedural error on their part or someone at the planning board moved it through faster than they should have. Which is it? A pause. I don't know yet. How long until they can break ground if the application clears? If the injunction doesn't hold and the application clears full review? He paused again. 3 weeks, maybe less if they've already mobilized a contractor. They had. I'd seen the truck. I called Dana that night. She'd been working the financial trail for 6 weeks, and she was close. Transaction records linking Summit View Acquisition's purchase payments to a holding account that ran through 2 intermediary LLCs before connecting back to a joint account held by Sharon and Greg Voss. Clean enough to follow, layered enough to have taken time. How much longer? I asked. I need the last wire transfer confirmation. I'm waiting on a records request from Delaware. 3 days, maybe 4. I have 19 days until the hearing. You'll have it in time, she said. But Cole, you need to show Garrett whatever you've been holding back. All of it. He can't walk into that courtroom half-loaded. She was right. I'd been keeping the manila envelope close, turning it over in my mind, waiting until the financial piece was complete so I could present everything at once. Clean, sequenced, unignorable. But 19 days wasn't comfortable anymore. That weekend, I went into the equipment shed and took the envelope down from the shelf behind the workbench. I sat on an overturned bucket in the dust and the smell of old motor oil and read through it again for the 4th time since August. My grandfather's handwriting, patient and exact, the way he did everything. I thought about what he'd built into that document and why, and what it was going to mean for 31 units of poured foundation sitting on land they had no right to touch. Monday morning, I drove to Garrett's office and put the envelope on his desk. He read it standing up. He didn't sit down once. When he finished, he looked at me for a long moment. "Cole," he said, "where did you get this?" "Behind his workbench," I said. "He left it there for someone to find." What does it cost a person to stay patient when the clock is running and everything they care about is sitting directly in the path of someone else's certainty? My grandfather Hank was not a simple man wearing simple clothes, doing simple things. He was a man who had watched, over the course of his adult life, 3 neighboring families lose land they'd held for generations. Not to drought, not to bad luck, not to their own failures, but to legal structures they didn't understand until it was too late. A corporation with a patient attorney and a document the family had never read carefully enough. A development company that filed the right paperwork in the right county office while the landowner was busy running a ranch. A bank that moved on a technicality buried in paragraph 9 of a deed the owner had signed without counsel. Hank had watched all 3 and drawn a conclusion. The conclusion was not get a better attorney. The conclusion was build something into the land itself that no one can take without destroying what they came for. In 1987, the same year Sharon's Regional Development Act was passed, which I found darkly appropriate, my grandfather retained a conservation law attorney in Cheyenne and spent 4 months restructuring the property deed inside a conservation trust. Not a standard conservation easement, a trust with a specific reversion clause written in language that his attorney had described, in a cover letter also inside the envelope, as unusually elegant in its self-executing mechanism. The clause read, in plain terms, as follows. Any unauthorized commercial development activity initiated on the property without the express written consent of the trust's designated beneficiary, that being, at the time of my grandfather's death, my father, and subsequently me, would trigger an automatic, irrevocable reversion of the full property title to the Wyoming Land Conservation Board. Not a penalty, not a fine, not a legal challenge that had to be won. An automatic reversion encoded directly into the deed, recognized under Wyoming Conservation Trust law, with no buyout provision, no appeal mechanism, and no grandfathering clause for structures already built. Anything constructed on the property during unauthorized development would not revert with it as an asset. It would revert as evidence. Garrett read the reversion clause 3 times. Then he read the cover letter from Hank's attorney. Then he sat down. "This is recorded," he said. "This trust is recorded with the county." "Yes, which means every title search on this property for the last 37 years would have shown it." "Yes, which means Sharon's attorney either didn't run a full title search," I said, "or ran one and didn't read it carefully, or read it and didn't understand what a self-executing reversion clause meant for an unauthorized development project." Garrett set the papers down on his desk very slowly. "Cole, they've already poured foundations on 22 units. They've pre-sold those units to buyers." "I know. The moment they broke ground without your consent, the reversion mechanism activated. Legally, automatically, without any action required on your part." "I know. They've been building on land that was already no longer theirs." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside his office window, the November sky was flat and gray and going nowhere. "Your grandfather wrote this in 1987, Garrett said finally. 37 years ago. "He told me about it once," I said. "Fishing, when I was 12. I forgot about it for 30 years. Garrett looked at me. "And Sharon had no idea."
She had every opportunity to find out, I said. She just didn't look. What is the difference between a trap that was set for someone and a trap that someone built entirely with their own hands? One impatient decision at a time. 5 days before the injunction hearing, Sharon broke ground on the remaining 9 units. I stood at my northern fence line in the cold and watched the excavators move. 3 machines working in a coordinated pattern across the section of my grandfather's land they decided was already theirs. The sound carried clean in the November air. Diesel engines, the grind of tracks on frozen ground, the hollow percussion of a bucket biting into soil that my family had held for 73 years. Garrett called while I was still standing there. "They've filed a motion to dismiss the injunction," he said, on the grounds that the development application cleared full county planning review this morning. They're arguing the injunction is moot because the permit is now active. Can they do that? They just did. The hearing judge has to consider it. Cole, someone moved that application through planning review in 8 days. Full review normally takes 6 to 8 weeks. I didn't say anything. There's more, Garrett said. They've also filed a counter-complaint with the county assessor's office challenging your property tax classification as agricultural. If it goes through, your tax rate increases by a factor of roughly 4, retroactive 18 months. You'd owe back taxes within 90 days. I watched an excavator drag a long furrow through the north pasture, the same pasture where my father had taught me to drive a tractor when I was 9 years old. "How much?" I asked. Garrett told me. It was enough to matter. It was designed to be enough to matter. "There's something else," he said, and his voice shifted in a way that made me go still. The Ridgeline Estates PR firm posted a statement this morning on the community website and their social channels. It says the Mercer property dispute has been resolved in the association's favor following county planning approval, and that Phase 2 construction is proceeding as scheduled. They've included a rendering of the finished development. It's been shared about 400 times. I put the phone down for a moment. From where I stood, I could see 3 of the foundation forms they'd poured the previous week. Gray concrete rectangles sitting in the frozen grass like headstones for something that hadn't finished dying yet. Beyond them, the excavators were opening new ground. Workers in high-visibility vests moved between machines. A site supervisor was taking photographs on his phone, the kind of photographs you take when you think you're documenting a victory. I thought about the 4 families who'd gotten to this point, who'd stood somewhere like this, watching something irreversible-looking happen to land they'd loved, and calculated that the cost of continuing was higher than the cost of letting go. I thought about Pauline, the retired teacher, who'd spent 6 weeks fighting a water access permit while a man named Greg called to check in. I thought about my grandfather, 26 years old, watching his father's farm disappear into someone else's paperwork. I picked the phone back up. "Garrett," I said, "call the Wyoming AG's office today, not tomorrow, today, and call the DOJ Land Fraud Division. Tell them we have a complete file, financial records, recorded statements, a documented pattern across 5 properties, and a self-executing conservation trust reversion that activated the moment they broke ground. I've been waiting for you to say that. Tell them the hearing is in 5 days, and I need someone in that courtroom who understands what a federal racketeering pattern looks like when it's been running for 18 months. A pause. "And the trust document?" Garrett asked. "Bring the original," I said, "and make sure the court reporter is ready. Sharon is going to want to hear it read aloud." I hung up and stood there another minute in the cold, watching the machines work. Let them pour, I thought. Every yard of concrete they put down is another thing they built on land that already belonged to someone else. Let them finish. Have you ever watched someone celebrate a win so loudly, so publicly, that you knew, with complete certainty, they had no idea what they'd just walked into? The night before the hearing, I didn't sleep much, not from anxiety, from the particular kind of weight that settles in when something long and slow is finally about to become something fast and permanent. The file on my desk represented 4 months of careful, deliberate work,
But it also represented Pauline losing her 12 acres.
Bill signing documents at a title company that shared an address with the buyer.
Robert Tillon sitting at my kitchen table, turning a thermos in his hands, trying to find the words for something he'd known was wrong for 14 months and hadn't been able to say out loud until he drove out to a stranger's ranch on a Saturday morning. It represented 4 families who'd wanted to stay and couldn't. I thought about my father, who'd driven out here every summer he could manage after the divorce, who'd never stopped calling it home even when home was technically somewhere else, who'd left it to me not because I was the obvious choice, but because he knew I was the one who'd understand what it meant to hold something like this. Not as an investment, not as a legacy in the abstract, but as a place. A specific place with a specific smell in the morning and a specific quality of light on the ridge in October and specific elk that came down from the same tree line every dawn like a small, reliable promise that some things don't change. I thought about my grandfather writing that trust clause in 1987, sitting across a desk from a conservation attorney in Cheyenne, working through the language of a reversion mechanism he hoped would never need to be used, building a lock into the deed of land he'd bought for less than a used pickup truck because he'd watched enough good people lose good land to know that the threat never fully goes away. It just changes shape. He'd built the answer 37 years before the question arrived. I sat in his kitchen, the same table,
The same window with the same view,
and thought about what it means to inherit something from someone who understood you well enough to leave you exactly what you'd need. I owed in the clean finish, not a partial win, not a settlement, not Sharon retreating and reorganizing and finding the next corridor and the next family who didn't look hard enough at their deed. A complete, public, permanent finish. Tomorrow, I was going to give him one. Sharon Voss walked into the federal courtroom at 9:08 a.m., looking like a woman attending a formality. She had her attorney, a Cheyenne firm, expensive suits, the kind of practiced confidence that comes from winning enough hearings to stop preparing for the other kind. She had a binder. She had the county planning approval document, freshly printed, which her attorney had been planning to present as the centerpiece of a motion to dismiss. She had, based on her posture and the way she set her things down at the respondent's table, the complete expectation that this would be over by noon. She did not have a title search that went back further than 18 months. She did not know that Garrett had spent the previous 4 days on the phone with the Wyoming Attorney General's office and the DOJ's Land Fraud Division. She did not know that 3 investigators were already seated in the gallery when she walked in plain clothes, with credentials that would become relevant before the morning was finished. She did not know about the manila envelope. She saw me across the room. She gave me a brief, composed nod, the kind you give someone you've already beaten, and turned back to her attorney. The judge entered at 9:15. He was a compact, unhurried man who read everything put in front of him before responding to it, which I respected immediately. Sharon's attorney opened with the motion to dismiss. County planning approval, active development permit, injunction moot as a matter of law. Clean argument, well delivered, the kind that works when the other side has nothing unusual to say. Then Garrett stood up. He did not begin with the Conservation Trust. He began with the pattern. He presented the 5-property timeline first, each landowner along the ridgeline corridor, each easement claim, each sequence of zoning complaints, utility disruptions, access permit challenges, each sale to Summit View Acquisitions, LLC. Each transaction record Dama had traced through 2 intermediary LLCs back to a joint account held by Sharon and Gregory Voss. Garrett put the financial trail on the projector screen in the courtroom and walked through it, line by line, date by date, dollar by dollar. Sharon's attorney objected twice. The judge overruled both times and told him to let counsel finish. Then Garrett presented the direct statements. Sharon's letter on HOA letterhead. The association exercises its development rights. We don't need the owner's permission. We need their absence. Read aloud in full. The community meeting testimony with the date, the approximate attendance, and the verbatim quote from my notebook. Robert Tillen signed written account of the budget line labeled Corridor Facilitation and the board meeting where Sharon had announced the Mercer acquisition as concluded before it was. Pauline's statement. Bill's recorded account of the title company that shared an address with the buyer. Sharon was very still at the respondent's table. Her attorney leaned toward her and said something quietly. She shook her head once, a small, tight movement. Then Garrett said, "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce into evidence a recorded trust instrument filed with the Laramie County Recorder's Office in October of 1987, attached to the deed of the Mercer property, which has been a matter of public record for 37 years. He handed certified copies to the judge, to the court reporter, and to Sharon's attorney. The judge put on his reading glasses. The room was quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something is about to become irreversible. The judge read the reversion clause aloud. All of it. His voice was even and unhurried, the same way he did everything, and every word landed in the silence of that courtroom with the particular weight of language that had been written specifically to be read in a moment like this one. Any unauthorized commercial development activity initiated on the property without the express written consent of the trust's designated beneficiary triggers an automatic, irrevocable reversion of full property title to the Wyoming Land Conservation Board, with no buyout provision, no appeal mechanism, and no grandfathering clause for structures already built. Sharon's attorney asked for a recess. The judge said no. He set the document down and looked at the respondent's table over his glasses. "Counsel," he said, "your client's organization broke ground on this property without the consent of the trust beneficiary. Is that correct?" Sharon's attorney said they disputed the applicability of the trust instrument to the current development framework. The judge looked at him for a moment. "The trust instrument is recorded. It is attached to the deed. It has been a matter of public record since 1987. A standard title search of any reasonable depth would have disclosed it. Are you telling me your client proceeded with an $8.4 million development project on land carrying a recorded reversion clause without completing a full title search?" The silence that followed that question was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Garrett stood. "Your Honor, the reversion mechanism activated automatically upon first unauthorized ground disturbance, which occurred 6 weeks ago. The Wyoming Land Conservation Board has been notified and has filed a brief in support of the reversion, which I'm prepared to submit." He submitted it. The DOJ investigators in the gallery identified themselves. Sharon Voss turned and looked at them. It was the first time all morning that her composure showed a crack. Not a collapse, just a hairline fracture. The expression of someone who has just understood that the room they walked into was not the room they thought it was. Her attorney requested a continuance. The judge denied it. By 11:40 a.m., the injunction was upheld. The development permit was suspended pending federal review, and the court had issued a formal order initiating the Conservation Trust reversion process. The 31 completed units, $8.4 million in construction, 22 of them pre-sold to families who had absolutely no idea, were now sitting on land that belonged to the Wyoming Land Conservation Board, and everything built on that land was, per the trust clause, evidence rather than asset. I sat at the plaintiff's table and did not say anything for a long moment. Then Garrett leaned over and said quietly, "Do you want to make a statement for the record?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "He already made it, 37 years ago. When every piece finally lands in the right place, not because you forced it, but because you let the truth finish arranging itself, what does that kind of justice actually feel like from the inside?" The 31 units came down in March. It took 3 weeks. I didn't watch most of it. Not out of sentiment, but because there was actual ranch work to do, and I'd spent enough months looking at those foundations. But on the last day, when the final structure was gone and the restoration crew was beginning the soil work, I drove up to the northern fence line and stood there for a while. The land looked wrong at first, churned and raw, the way ground looks after something has been removed from it that shouldn't have been there. But underneath the disruption, the soil was the same soil it had always been. The ridge was the same ridge. The tree line hadn't moved. It would come back. It already was. The legal outcomes settled over the following months the way these things do, not all at once, but steadily, each piece closing in sequence. Greg Voss faced federal racketeering charges. The financial trail Dana had built, transaction by transaction through two shell LLCs back to the joint account, was, in the federal prosecutor's words, unusually complete for a case of this type. The HOA was dissolved by court order. Its remaining assets were liquidated. The 22 families who had pre-purchased units received full refunds from the seized assets, plus damages for carrying costs and legal fees. None of them had known. Every one of them deserved better than what Sharon's operation had sold them. Pauline got a letter from the Wyoming AG's office acknowledging her written statement as material to the investigation. She called me when it arrived. She cried a little. I didn't say much. Sometimes there isn't much to say. Robert Tillen still lives in Ridgeline Estates, the original development, Phase 1, which had nothing legally wrong with it. He sent me a card in April. It said, "I should have knocked sooner. I'm glad I knocked at all." I put it on the filing cabinet. The land itself is now protected under a permanent conservation easement administered by the Wyoming Land Conservation Board, an outcome my grandfather's trust clause had always made possible, and that the development, in a strange way, had accelerated. The easement runs for 100 years. Nobody is building anything on that ridge for a century. I moved back into the house in October, the same month the restoration was certified complete. The same kitchen, the same view, the same window where the morning light comes in at an angle that hasn't changed since my grandfather sat at this table drinking coffee before dawn and writing in the careful, patient handwriting I recognize now every time I look at the trust document. The elk came back down from the ridge the first morning I was there. 4 of them, moving slow along the upper pasture, the way they always have, the way they were doing before any of us arrived, and will keep doing long after we're gone. I watched them from the window with my coffee and thought about a 12-year-old boy sitting in a fishing boat, half listening to an old man say something that sounded like weather. Don't fight a man's first move. Wait for his last one. Sharon made 31 of them. If someone you loved left you exactly what you'd need before you even knew you'd need it, what would you do to make sure it wasn't wasted?
This was a story about what happens when someone mistakes silence for surrender. Sharon Voss never saw Cole Mercer as a threat. She saw a quiet man, living alone on 62 acres, without the connections or the momentum to stop what she'd already done to 4 other families. She'd run the same play 4 times and won 4 times. And each win made her less careful. Each win narrowed the distance between her confidence and her carelessness. That's the thing about people who abuse systems. They don't fail because they're caught off guard. They fail because success makes them stop looking. She handed him a signed document on his own property. She made verbal threats on a recording she didn't know existed. She put her intentions in writing, on official letterhead, under her own name and title. She said the quiet part out loud, in a room full of 30 witnesses. And she broke ground on land carrying a recorded legal clause she never bothered to find because she'd already decided she didn't need to check. Every single thing that destroyed her, she built herself. Cole didn't win because he was smarter. He didn't win because he got lucky. He won because he understood something most people forget when someone comes at them hard and fast and confident. Your first reaction is almost never your best move. He stayed calm when she expected panic. He documented when she expected emotion. He waited when she expected resistance. And while she was busy constructing her victory, he was quietly building the most complete case she would never see coming. The Corps of Engineers taught him to read a system before he touches it. His grandfather taught him to wait for the last move, not the first. 37 years before any of this happened, an old man in a Cheyenne law office built an answer to a question that hadn't been asked yet. That's not luck. That's a kind of love. The kind that says, I see what's coming for you, and I'm not going to leave you without what you need. Cole honored that. Every step, every folder, every dated photograph, every recorded conversation. That was him honoring something his grandfather built long before either of them knew it would matter. Now, most of you watching this have never dealt with an HOA land grab, but most of you have dealt with some version of Sharon Voss. The manager who puts the threat in writing because they're certain you won't use it. The neighbor who escalates because they've never been pushed back on. The person in the room who says the quiet part out loud because they've decided you don't matter enough to be careful around. That's the real story here. And the question I'll leave you with is this. At what point would you have stopped waiting? And would that have been the right call, or would it have cost you everything? Drop your answer below. I read more of these than you'd think. And if you're drawn to stories where patience and preparation beat power and noise, stay with me. There are more where this came from.